To start, let's remove all 4 lug nuts and take this wheel off with a 19mm socket. With a small pry bar, I'm going to stick it right in here in the slot of the caliper and squish the rotor into the caliper a little bit. That's hopefully going to allow me to compress the piston and make it a little bit easier to get this off. Next, with a 12mm socket, go ahead and remove these 2 bolts. This is what's going to get us the caliper off of the bracket. Pull the caliper off, set it aside on top of the strut here, just wherever you put it. Make sure it's putting no pressure on the brake hose. Now we can remove the pads. You can use a little pry bar if needed. Now the 17mm socket, remove these 2 caliper bracket mounting bolts. Leave this one in a couple threads. Okay, take this out, set that aside, remove the rotor. That exposes the hub, which we will have to clean. You can see it's a little bit dirty here, and it's not just the dirt that matters, it's the fact that it has raised areas and corrosion buildup. So this one's not too bad, but I do want to take a wire brush to it and clean it down nice and flat. If you had one that was completely rotted, you would want to sand that down gently. You don't want to eat material away from it, but you want it to have a nice flat surface for the new rotor to mount on. Next, I want to apply a thin coating of anti-seize to the surface of the hub. That way the rotor does not seize on in the future, and this will hopefully prevent the majority of any rust buildup that might occur. You don't want a lot of this. You don't want it to fling out once you start driving at higher speeds and it gets hot, but you do want to cover the whole surface, especially this inner ring here. This is where the rotor will seize if it does seize. Slide on the new rotor backwards so that we can clean this surface here. This will be coated from the factory in Cosmoline oil, and you want those oils off of here. That way you have a nice clean braking surface. You don't want this getting on your brake pads. Flip it over, install it the right way, and clean off this area as well. Now we have our caliper bracket on our workbench. First thing I like to do is take off the hardware. Might need a little pry bar. There we go. Take that off, and we're going to go ahead and clean in here. You can use a wire brush if your rust isn't too significant. If it's not that bad. For me, I actually do have quite a bit of pitting here, so I would want to sand this down. You can use a sanding disc, or if you don't have one, you can actually take a pry bar screwdriver and just dig at this. Basically, you want this all to come off, otherwise the pads will get squished in between the 2 sides here, because this bubbles up and basically grows, and then you'll have braking issues. So I'm going to take this cutting disc and very, very gently sand down the surface. Now that these areas are clean, let's add a little bit of brake grease. You don't need a lot. This is way too much what I have on my brush here. There we go. Just a little light coating. That way it'll prevent rust from building up in the future. Now you want to take your new anti-rattle clips and press them on. Make sure that they go on all the way. If they don't, that means you likely have more rust to clean up here. And of course you do that to both sides, just like this. And now we actually have to take these slider pins out so we can clean inside of the bore. This one's kind of stuck in there, so I'm going to take a pair of pliers. It does move, it's just really hard to pull out. I'm going to do them one at a time, and I'll show you why in a second. Give it some twists. Make sure you don't damage the boot when you do this if you have to grab them with pliers. There we go. All right, pull this one all the way out. Take the boot off. All right, so this one has a rubber piece on the end of it. It's important to put it back in the same hole that it came out of. The rubber piece is there for a reason, most likely vibration dampening, noise reduction, things like that. And if it goes into the opposite hole, well, it's not going to perform its duty as it should. So I thought these were going to be rusted. They are not. So most likely this little rubber piece is just swollen, making this kind of stuck in there. So this is okay to reuse. Let's just make sure we lubricate it. If you do have rust and a lot of rot here build up, then you would have to wire wheel it and make sure it's still reusable. Sometimes they're not reusable, so you have to get new ones. Make sure that little ridge is clean. For me it is. That's where the boot seals up. If you don't have that clean, you're gonna have water building up inside and you'll have issues. Just wire brush it if needed. Get all the debris out of there. So this is clean. If this had rust inside here, you'd want to use a bore brush, clean it all out. Mine is okay. So I'm just going to add some grease to the inside of the boot here. This is going to act as a reserve of grease. I can't put a whole lot on the slider because it'll just get wiped off by the boot. So I'm going to put it inside of the boot here. And I'm going to take some grease up the slider a little bit. Make sure I get some on that top ridge there that I mentioned. Slide the slider in. Give it a couple twists. Squeeze the boot to get the excess air and grease out if you accidentally put too much. All right, now let's do the same to the other one. This one's also kind of stuck, so I'm going to grab this one with pliers as well. There we go. All right, no rust on this one either. As you can see, this one does not have the rubber piece on it, so that's why you want to make sure that they go where they came out of. Clean everything up, add some grease in here, not too much. Get it in that ridge at the top, and let's slide the pin in. Give it a couple twists. Okay, squeeze the air out if needed. Give it a couple twists, and now this is ready to install on the vehicle. Take your caliper bracket, position it in place here. Take the 2 bolts, start them on. Don't put any grease or anti-seize on these. If you want to put anything, put thread locker. Bottom these out. 80 foot-pounds for both of these bolts. The inner pad is the one with the wear indicator, and I like to put that on the bottom, on the drag side of the rotor. Basically what that means, it's the rotor, it's going to drag the little tab out, not into the pad. That way it'll make a squealing noise telling you that your brakes are low. And then the outer pad does not get a wear indicator. At this point, if your pads don't slide easily, that means you didn't clean up the bracket enough. And like I mentioned earlier, they're getting compressed, squeezed. So when you release the brake pedal, they might not release as much as they should, and you'll get braking issues. So now that these are in here, let's grab our caliper, and we need to compress the piston in. That way we make room for the thickness of the new pads. You can easily do that with a caliper depression tool like this, or some large pliers if that's what you have. Basically, what you need to do is just slowly squeeze this piston in. The key here is slow, because if you go fast, you potentially could damage things. All right, that bottomed out right there. I'm going to release my tool, take it out. I'm going to make sure that the surface is nice and clean. Apply a little bit of grease to the outer ring of the piston here. That's going to help the brakes operate quietly and smoothly, as well as on these 2 outer ears of the caliper for the same exact reason. Not a lot, just a little to coat the surface. And now slide the caliper over the pads and onto the bracket. Take your 2 bolts, thread those in, and then we'll torque them to 17 foot-pounds. All right, that's done. Now you want to do the same thing to the other side. Check your master cylinder, pump up your brakes, and let's put the wheel on. Go ahead and put the wheel back on. Start on all 4 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and then torque them to 80 foot-pounds. Perfect.